Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Gedeman. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit organization Reckoning, Inc., and producer of the radio and podcast series The Reckoning. And I'm here to tell you about a new project that we are embarking on that has grown directly out of our work producing the Reckoning series. It's called the Kentucky African American Civil War Soldiers Project, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Starting with why we think this project is urgently needed and important. Slavery was, by very definition, a dehumanizing experience for the African slaves that were brought over to work the various fields and do the various industrial work that slaves were forced to do. And enslaved people were considered and treated as property. And as part of that dehumanization, their names were not recorded in official documents, especially census records, until after the Civil War in 1870. And even when they were recorded in any kind of official documents, it was only with their first names. And collectively, what that means is that for African Americans trying to research the history of their family, they run into a brick wall because of the lack of information about who their ancestors were, because of how white people did or didn't keep track of black people during the era of slavery. So in producing this radio series, The Reckoning, part of the focus of our work was trying to find living descendants of people who were enslaved by the Bullitt family of Oxmoor, a plantation here in Louisville. And it is exceedingly hard to do that kind of research precisely because there are so few written records that give us first names and especially last names for enslaved people. So it's very difficult to find them in the census records after the Civil War if you don't know the name they went by in slavery. And so in researching The Reckoning, we found a memoir written by one of the members of the Bullitt family who mentions by name an enslaved man named James Sanders. And with that information, we were able to find him and his wife, her name was Eliza Julia, in the 1870 census. We knew that he was enslaved by a man named Archibald Dixon, who had married into the Bullitt family. And with those pieces of information, those three pieces of information, we knew his first name and last name, we knew his wife's name, we knew who he was enslaved by, and we knew where he was enslaved, which was Henderson, Kentucky. And once you have those pieces of information, then you can begin to look for enslaved people in freedom times. While we were doing the Reckoning series, I eventually did find some of the descendants, and one of those descendants, when interviewed, described this knowledge about her ancestors that we were able to share with her because of this research that we had done as life-changing, and said that having this information about her enslaved ancestors was, for her, an important part of reparations, giving back what had been taken from her family by white America during enslavement. And she specifically expressed a wish that this information be freely available to African Americans without any kind of fees. It can be very expensive to do genealogical research, especially when you have limited financial means. So this project is a direct response to her request and to the difficulty that we experienced in trying to even find her and learn the names of her ancestors, precisely because there are so few written records of enslaved people. Now, there was one circumstance where white enslavers did keep track of enslaved people's names, and that's when they had a good reason to do so, and it usually had to do with money. So, for instance, names show up in wills because a rich slaveholder would be bequeathing slaves by name to their descendants, their white descendants. And similarly, in lawsuits and in bills of sale, where one enslaver is selling an enslaved person to another enslaver, it will often have the first name, sometimes the age, sometimes other distinguishing characteristics. But rarely do we see these names otherwise. There is one exception, though, and that is one institution that did record enslaved people's names was the U.S. military during the Civil War. And that was because they started to have enslaved men enlist in the U.S. Army as soldiers starting in 1863 and into 1864 and 65. However, the border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and for a period of time, the District of Columbia itself, slavery was still legal. And President Lincoln and the Lincoln government was highly aware that they didn't want to alienate loyal Unionists who were slaveholders, and so they held off as late as possible. And in particular, the latest place that enslaved men were able to join the army was Kentucky. Okay, and so part of the deal that Lincoln made with loyal enslavers was, if you lose any of your slaves to the army, we will compensate you $300 per enslaved man who joins the U.S. Army. So, with this in mind, they needed to keep track of this information. So we uncovered, in doing the research on the reckoning, multiple sets of ledger books that list the names of roughly 15,000 enslaved Kentuckians who fought in the Civil War as part of what was known as the U.S. Colored Troops, or USCT. These records give us all the basic information that we need, or that African American families need, to find their enslaved ancestors. That's the first and last name of the soldier, their birth year and where they were born, and the names of their enslavers. And with the name of their enslavers, we can go and find out physically where they were enslaved, because we can find the enslavers in the 1850 and 1860 census. Now, these records, these ledger books, still are miscatalogued at the National Archives as being lists of soldiers from Missouri, not Kentucky. And because of that, we continue to the miscataloguing has continued on Ancestry and Family Search, where they are also miscatalogued. So they've been lost to history until now. It has been suggested that these documents provide a Rosetta Stone for African American genealogy, and we'll explain exactly how. So what we want to do with these documents is to research the lives of these enslaved men who joined the army, going backward as far as we can and going forward as far as we can, to help restore the family histories of African Americans who descend from these men from Kentucky. The resulting data that we're going to accrue from this research will be placed on a free searchable database for use by African Americans in Kentucky and all over the United States who descend from these soldiers. We believe this will be a treasure trove of information about these 15,000 roughly enslaved Kentuckians that are in these ledger books, and that it has the potential to impact millions of descendants who are alive today. So let's take a look at these ledger books and what they tell us. So these hold important key information. From left to right, you see the name of the enslaved person, first name and last name that they went by in the army, where they were born. We can figure out when they were born because of their age, what they did. In nearly all cases, it's farmer or laborer, but occasionally we'll see blacksmiths and carpenters and other skilled artisans. And then where they enlisted, we know what military unit they were involved with. And then over here on the far right of your screen, you will see name of owner if a slave. And this is critical information that is found in no other document. There's no other place you can look to find a list of enslaved people that lists their enslaver. And then on the final right-hand column is date of certificate if given, and that's a certificate of compensation. Okay, so this is the paperwork. Again, the whole reason why these ledgers were kept was to keep track of money that might be owed to enslavers. Now, there were additional ledgers that were kept for soldiers who were drafted, who were impressed into service. So after the Union Army or after the Lincoln government allowed African Americans to enlist in the Army, they still didn't have enough soldiers in the Union Army, so that the second wave of African American men who joined the Army were impressed into service, meaning they were forced into service, or rather they were taken from their enslavers and put into the Army. So this is another way we find people. And indeed, this is how we were able to find the enslaved man who was in Henderson, Kentucky, who was owned by Archibald Dixon and had married into the Bullitt family of Oxmoor. And so we see here, and this is the key piece of information, the kind of information that these ledgers contain, and that is that we know the name that these men went by in the Army. Okay, and we'll explain why this is so very important in a moment. So originally, you would think to look for James Sanders, because that's the name that he went by in freedom. But it turns out, in many, many cases, the enslaved men, when they joined the Army, were automatically given the last name of their enslaver. So here we have Jim Dixon and his owner, A. Dixon, Archibald Dixon. Now, once you know the name that they went by in the Army, you can go find their military records. And all of these military records have been digitized and are easily found on the internet. So here is Jim Dixon's record in the military. And we can find out all sorts of things about these soldiers in these military files, including, in some cases, there is the paperwork that the enslaver put in after the war, or at the end of the war, near the end of the war, to get their $300. Now, this is not for Jim Sanders, but this is for another person that I found who was a man who was enslaved in Louisville and joined the U.S. Army from Louisville. And this is the paperwork that his enslaver put in 1866 to try to get paid. Now, if you were going to go looking for these men who are in these ledgers, and this is our ultimate goal, is to go through these ledgers and look for all of the men that are in there and find out what became of them. One of the first things we want to do is to see if they died during the Civil War. Roughly somewhere between a quarter and a third of African Americans who served in the Union Army died during the war, most of the time because of disease. So in this ledger book, you can see the name of the person, when they died, where they died, and what they died of. And in all cases on this particular page, these are diseases of various sorts. So we'll check and see if they died during the war. If they didn't die during the war, then we'll go look to see if they applied for a pension after the war. In the late 1880s and 1890s, Congress passed legislation enabling people who had served in the Civil War to get a military pension if they were an invalid. So this is really, really important, these cards, and I'll explain why. So in the case of this James Sanders, he was known in the Army as James Dixon, but otherwise as James Sanders. So if you are an African American today, and you knew through oral history that you had an ancestor who served in the military during the Civil War, you might go looking for the name that they were known by in freedom. So let's just say you knew that you had an ancestor named James Sanders, and you went looking for his military records. Well, you wouldn't find them because they're under a different name. So here's a piece of information to give you an idea of why this is so urgently important if you're going to do research into enslaved people, specifically in Kentucky. There were about 186,000 soldiers that served in the United States colored troops. Okay, so of those who survived the war, and we're guessing that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 140,000, approximately 100,000 of these pension cards, according to FamilySearch.org, which is one of the largest genealogical websites, they have found 100,000 of these cards that have two names, such as James Dixon and James Sanders. Okay, based on a sample of these that we examined, somewhere between 80 and 90% appear to be members of the U.S. colored troops. So that means that over half of the soldiers who applied for pensions, who were African American, used a different name in freedom than they did in the Army. So these pension cards, when you combine that with the information that we can find in these ledgers, give us an enormous amount of information. And one of the things you can do once you have these pension cards and the numbers contained on them is to go look for pension files. So these pension files, which are held at the National Archives in Washington, or rather, I take that back, I think they're in the St. Louis National Archives, there is all sorts of information contained in them that could be enormously helpful to African American families that descend from these men, including health information. So in this case, there's information that this man suffered from what was then known as rheumatism of the arms and shoulders, and disease of back. Well, when one of his descendants saw this, he immediately thought of his own symptoms from a rare form of cancer of the blood that he suffered from. And he immediately saw the connection between his own symptoms and the symptoms that his second great-grandfather suffered from. Also, there are things that you can find in these pension files that you can find nowhere else, such as marriage certificates, such as death certificates. And in the case of this death certificate here, and you find out where James Sanders died, it was in a military invalid home. With a little bit of research, we determined that there was a military cemetery right next door to this, and checked in their records and found the grave of James Sanders, and was able to give that information to his living descendants, and they were able to visit his grave. And this is the man, Russ Bolds, who suffers from this rare form of cancer that apparently he shared with his ancestor. And by the way, just to add one more detail, this man, Russ Bolds, had for years been walking up and down the aisles of this military cemetery where his grandfather told him they had an ancestor buried named James Sanders. And he looked and he looked and he looked, and he could never find a headstone for James Sanders, and that's because the U.S. military considered his name to be James S. Dixon, Corporal 118th USCT. So, here are the kinds of resources that are available to us that we can research the lives of these 15,000 Kentucky soldiers. So we've already talked about the enlistment and draft ledger books, the military records, the death registers, the pension cards, which lead us to the pension files. Then, once you know the name of the enslaver, this opens up an entire other world of information we can find out. We can look to the census records from 1850 and 1860 and even farther back, and we can determine where the enslaver lived, and that's also where the enslaved person was enslaved. Then we can go back and look at slave schedules, which were part of the census in the 1850 and 1860 census. And these are lists of enslaved people that mention them not by name, but just by age and gender. And this helps give us another way of determining whether that soldier was on that particular plantation in 1850 and 1860. Also, once we know the name of the enslaver, we can go looking in wills, deeds, estate settlements. If somebody died and they didn't have a will, there would be it would go into probate and there'd be an estate settlement. These estate settlements often have lists of enslaved people by name. If they were Catholic, if the enslaver was Catholic, as many are in Louisville and in Nelson, Washington, and Marion counties, we can find baptism and marriage records. It was important for the Catholic Church to keep track of enslaved people when they were born and when they were married. So we can find records that mention them by name, first name, and who their enslaver was. Then in peacetime, we can look in newspapers and church newsletters to see if we can find records pertaining to these formerly enslaved people and their family. And by the way, we can look in the census in 1870 and all the way up to the 1940s. And in 2022, we're going to have access to the 1950 census. And we can find the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these enslaved men. And eventually put together family trees that go downward from the enslaved man down to the present. And if we're lucky, in the wills and estate settlements and deeds, we may find the names of the parents or the siblings of the enslaved man who was in the army. So we can build a family tree that goes backwards in time and forwards in time. So what are we proposing to do with all of this information? So we've already established there's roughly 15,000 soldiers from Kentucky. We're going to guess that at least 10,000 of those men lived into freedom. If so, and that they may have applied for pensions. So based on statistics kept by the folks at Family Search, they say that each one of these men could have as many as 1,700 living descendants today. So 10,000 by 1,700, that's 17 million descendants that could be alive today that descend from these 15,000 soldiers. So we are, in this project, turning to a panel of African-American scholars from colleges and universities across the state of Kentucky, including our HBCUs, Simmons College and Kentucky State University. We have a project manager that we've hired. His name is Dr. Brandon Wilson. He's a research fellow at the University of Kentucky and himself a descendant of one of the USCT soldiers from Kentucky. We're working with Dr. Patrick Lewis from the Filson, who's acting as a historical and technical advisor. We have scholars, again, from all sorts of schools across the state, including the eminent African-American historian George C. Wright, who's a vice president at the University of Kentucky and author of 3 books on Kentucky African-American history. Vanessa Holden, also at the University of Kentucky. Karen McDaniel from Kentucky State University. Professors Karen C. and Andrew Baskin from Simmons College. Brian Hackett, Eric Jackson, and David Childs from Northern Kentucky University, Selena Doss from Western Kentucky University, and several others who are helping us. I also want to mention that we're working with the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky, and they are keenly interested in being involved with the research that we're doing, and they're going to help guide us to determine how to do this research and how to present it in a way that is proper and culturally sensitive. We are partnering with the Filson Historical Society and the Kentucky Historical Society. We're going to publish these findings in a free searchable database on our project website, which will be perpetually maintained and also stored on archive.org as a backup. So this is important because a lot of people do these kinds of large-scale digital humanities projects. Then they lose their funding, and then the website is orphaned, and it no longer works properly, or it breaks down when you click on links. All this information is also going to be available on familysearch.org, which is a completely free genealogical website, and on ancestry.com, because so many African-American descendants have already started to do genealogical research, and they will easily be able to find this information because of the way Family Search and Ancestry work. They will shoot little emails saying, hey, we've got new information about your ancestors, and they'll give them a link where they can click on it. We're going to share the project data with scholars from various disciplines: historians, sociologists, economists, people studying African American studies, and we're especially going to provide this to African American scholars. There is tremendous potential here for collaborations with various kinds of artists. We've talked to visual artists, writers, playwrights. There's all sorts of creative ways these stories can be told using the arts, and we're very excited about that possibility. So to get this started, and as a proof of concept of this larger idea of researching all 15,000 of these men, we're going to start by biting off a much smaller group, 230 soldiers from Jefferson County that exist in these ledgers with the enslaver names. We're going to start this in the summer of 2022 and continue it during the upcoming academic year. We are going to hire 4 student interns. We're also going to be working with experienced genealogists affiliated with the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky and others, who will research each of these soldiers under the direction of our project manager, Brandon Wilson. We're going to partner with FamilySearch.org. They're going to give us free access to all of these documents that our researchers will need: the census, the slave schedules, the wills, the estate settlements, all of the things we've talked about, and the ledgers themselves, and the military records and pension records. We'll use their platform to create family trees for all these soldiers and their families. We'll publish all this research in a free searchable database on the project website. Then we're going to work with educators to create free curricula for K through 12 students. These will be available to public, Catholic, and independent schools across the state. The total cost for this pilot project is $150,000, and that's the immediate goal that we're looking to raise in the coming weeks and months to cover the costs of these interns and other expenses related to doing this research over the summer. If you are interested in learning more about this project, or you'd like to make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit organization, Reckoning, Inc., you see on the screen my contact information, dan@reckoningradio.org, and we have a link on our website where you can specifically make donations. If you happen to have an account at the Community Foundation of Louisville, we are an approved charity in their system. And there's also our address and a link where you can make an online contribution if you would like at any level. And we thank you so much for your interest in this project, and hope, if you are so moved, that you will help us make it a reality. Thank you.